Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how you doing? Grab your coffee, maybe a snack, and let's get into it. So, there is something that I want to talk about, okay? And it has to do with food storage tips that maybe you have learned or you're new to prepping or you're too young to know about these things, okay, that are from the Great Depression, okay? And a lot of us have been doing a lot of these things to, fill up our prepper pantries and things like that, okay? Now, with inflation at 40-year highs, right, and worrisome news events coming at us every single day, and I'm one of those, and I try and bring you current events, and I try to bring it to you so it's not so doomish and gloomish and stuff like that. I try to bring a little bit of humor and stuff like that, okay? And it's natural to wonder how other generations handled such hard times. An era that looms large in terms of past national crises is the Great Depression, okay? Either our grandparents went through it, our great-grandparents went through it, okay? Many of us, we know the stories, we've heard the stories of how our grandparents or great-grandparents, they scrimped and they saved during the 30s, during the Dust Bowl, right? And after all, the stock market crashed October 29th, 1929, triggered an economic collapse that lasted more than a decade. As banks failed and businesses closed, more than 25% of America's workforce became unemployed. Now, historians have captured fascinating details about how the Great Depression changed our way of life. It's storming. The Great Depression was a time when Americans had food front and foremost in their minds and were worrying about it every single day. For the first time, the federal government took steps to feeding citizens, and new terms like food scientist and home economist and dietary recommendations entered our vocabularies as people searched for answers to our nation's hunger problems. And new food conglomerates even began offering packaged and processed foods to meet the growing technology of the 20th century and the convenience modern Americans sought out. Yet, as we have before and since, especially during tough times, okay, many Americans took things into their own hands by starting victory gardens. That's what they were known as during the Great Depressions. They were known as victory gardens in the 1930s. And their efforts to make the best use of what they had can teach us some important lessons about food storage. Now, one of them is use what you have to make do. During the Depression, many folks used the phrase make do, as in, we'll make do with this for now. And those two words represented a resilience and a strength to get through those hard times. Preserving food was a huge part of like the summer times, And to remember a time or two when, like, our grandparents, our great-grandparents were drying vegetables and things like that, you know, out in the sun, and yeah, okay. If they put cheesecloth to keep the bugs off. Okay, it's just, they didn't have dehydrators. They made do. Now, here are some food storage tips that we can learn from our grandparents and great-grandparents that went through the Great Depression, okay? Now, how to extend the life of your fresh produce? By canning, pressure canning, right? Home canning, which we all do, well, majority, means of survival for many Depression-era families. Would you stop? And I've shown you in previous videos how much I've canned. Okay, you have shown me through pictures how much you've canned. Green beans, commonly called string beans during the Great Depression, and cut corn were most frequently canned vegetables. But thrifty 1930s homemakers also canned dandelion leaves, yeah, radish leaves, Swiss chard, spinach, collard greens. Now, pickling preserves food by submerging it in salty, acidic solution, like lemon juice or vinegar. Adding spices to the solution can enhance the flavor of that food. Of course, you know, you can have cucumbers led the pickling list of vegetables, but not far behind were carrots, onions, beans, cauliflower, squash, okra, beets, asparagus, Brussels sprouts. And homemakers, they also made a pickled relish of mixed chopped veggies. Have you tried fermentation? Whereas pickling involves soaking a food into an acidic brine. Fermenting does not involve adding any acid. And the sour flavor that results from fermentation is due to a chemical reaction between the food's sugars and any naturally presented bacteria. Many of America's German and Asian immigrants were well acquainted with fermentation and used this process to preserve leftover and end-of-season veggies during the Great Depression. Now, another way that a lot of us use is to dehydrate. Drying or dehydrating was another way of food preservation during that time by using a combination of warmth, low humidity, and air current. And you can remove enough of the moisture from food so that bacteria and yeast and mold doesn't grow. Another bonus is dried food retains much of its nutrition. So that's why a lot of us will do fruits, veggies, we'll do jerky, stuff like that. Now, has anyone here made a root cellar yet. Me either. One is because, you know, sinkholes can happen, stuff like that. So, root cellars are an integral part of pioneer life. However, during the 30s and 40s, the Farm Security Administration and the Office of War Information encouraged Americans to reacquaint themselves with this ancient means of food preservation. And when the Dust Bowl happened, and it sharpened the misery of the Depression for many Americans living in the drought-stricken Southern Plains region of the United States, root cellars helped families preserve what little that they did have. Now, there's many ways that you could do a root cellar. I've heard of people taking broken freezers, you know, like the deep freezers, digging a hole, putting the broken freezer in there, and that can be a root cellar. It's one way of doing it. Now, by definition, a root cellar is a storage location that uses natural cooling, insulation, and humidity of the earth. Now, Depression-era homemakers embraced new methods to make and preserve foods, like home refrigerators, and the advent of frozen food were game changers, really. In the 1910s and the 1920s, there was a man by the name of Clarence Birdseye. And his observation of frozen food in Newfoundland, Canada, eventually led to his experimentation with frozen peas and the rise of the frozen food industry, hence Birdseye food. Now, at the beginning of the 30s, just 8% of American homes had electric refrigerators. However, by the end of that decade, that number jumped to like 44%. And newspaper magazines, ads from the Times reveal a luxury item that became rapidly down in price over the course of the Depression. You can get a new fridge for like under $100. Now you go to a Lowe's or Home Depot or an appliance store, you're looking at $3,000 for a new fridge. And for those lucky enough to have this modern appliance in their kitchens, freezing meats and produce became a way to preserve fresh food for their families. Now, maintaining a store food supply has been an essential part of survival for countless generations in times of need. However, one of the biggest questions people had both then and now is the safety of their preserved foods. And there's 5 factors that you have to consider while storing food, whether it's Mylar bag or pressure canned or whatever. Temperature, okay. Moisture, oxygen, light, the container that it's in, and pests. Now, freeze grain-based foods for a few days before long-term storage to kill insect eggs and larvae, like rice, flour, stuff like that. Store food in airtight plastic or metal containers. Use the first in, first out rotation method. Keep up on your inventory. Immediate cleanup after food spills. Regularly wipe out your pantry shelves, vacuum the pantry area, keep up food up off of the floor. Use caulking to seal up any cracks or anywhere food is stored. Now, the shutdowns and supply shortages, they triggered that was triggered, I should say, by this pandemic. Caused, I don't know how many Americans, but not just Americans, all around the world, to turn to home gardening for their food. And the trend seems to be continuing as we face more uncertainty in our daily lives. Now, there is this National Gardening Association, and it was a study that was conducted not long before the pandemic, found that about 1/3 of American households grew some of their own kind of food. And then in May of 2021, there was a survey done of 2,000 Americans, and they found that about 65% of respondents were growing some of their own produce. Although the 1930s must have been a scary time to live through, a sense of positivity runs through much of the diaries and the letters from that time. And if you watch a channel called Great Depression Cooking, and it's with a woman, her name is Clara, she has passed since then. If you listen to the way that she talks, it's always about positivity and how her mother cooked and things like that. I suggest you watch her videos. However, you view that sense of positivity, whether it's glass half full metaphor or this too shall pass way of thinking. You may have hit on the best lesson of all from the Great Depression years. And if you're lucky enough to have learned from being taught from your parents, your grandparents, great-grandparents, about those lessons that they learned during that time. Right, Stormy? All right, guys, I'm out of here. I love you. I'll see you in the next one. You stay safe, you stay positive, you keep prepping. And as always, fearless. Right, Bug?